This is Bob Purcell speaking from Central Massachusetts, and I'll be delivering the presentation with Xander, who's located in Santa Fe. I know sometimes people like to know where people are coming from or speaking from. And it's good to be here today, and we're very thankful for being offered the opportunity to talk about our biomass harvesting guidelines. Um, Xander and I, as Mike mentioned, are staff with the Forest Guild, but this process was run mostly by members of the Forest Guild in the Northeast, and they joined together in what's called the Forest Guild Biomass Working Group for the Northeast. The group still continues, but most of its work occurred about a year and a half ago over a period of time, and we still rely on them for input and guidance on this. So it was a combination of members and staff running this process. So let's begin. The first question that arose for the Forest Guild is, why were biomass guidelines needed? We could see that the interest and expansion of biomass harvesting was beginning. It had been going on for a while, but it was increasing in activity, and certainly federal and state programs for climate change mitigation and energy use was going to increase the amount of biomass that was harvested. And we also understood that this could be good or bad for the land, depending on what happens there. For foresters, and particularly the Guild, Mike, thank you for the introduction for the Guild. We've been around for about 15 years, and it's true. We try to set a high bar for forestry activities, what we call excellent forestry. For we're shooting for practicing the very best forestry that's possible. So there's a couple of ways that guide us. Number one is, we try to mimic natural processes, and so we're always looking at natural stands that have been unharvested and the structure and dynamics of those stands to inform how we should perform our practices when we do management. So in the case of biomass, we look at natural stands and look at the amount of structure in natural stands and the amount of downwoody material, and then try to match that up with proper forestry activities. So it's very important for us to understand what the science says and then to adapt our management accordingly. Another factor, in a lot of states we operate, there aren't very direct laws about forest harvesting. Most of these are some regulations, but included mostly best management practices. And as with the Guild, we don't consider ourselves bounded by the laws, the regulations, or even the BMPs. We're always looking for what is the best possible forestry for the land, for the forest, and for our society, and how can we practice that. So we're not bounded by what exists at the current time. And the third one I'll mention is, we're very concerned about the social contract that the public gives us to practice forestry. As I said, there aren't always regulations or laws that guide forestry, so it's really up to us and our profession to act accordingly and to gain that approval and to keep that, quote, social contract going. So we're concerned that as we move into biomass for energy and climate change, that we get to do our job. We think that we can have a positive effect on climate change and contribute to our nation's energy requirements, and we want a chance to do that and use the forest appropriately to do that. If we're not out in front of this issue and don't have a good answer to what are the guidelines and how do we manage ourselves as we increase these harvests, the public will lose confidence in us. So we wanted to make sure that we're ahead of that issue and that we have proper guidelines in place. We want to avoid someone else setting rules, regulations, laws about forestry that may not help us in the field, and so we would like to be in front of that issue and assure the public that things are going to go right here. So for all those reasons, we dug into this issue about biomass. And what we knew that BMPs in each state, they exist in all the states, but they were set up perhaps several decades ago for water quality issues when the water quality regulations, national regulations came into being. And so although they're good regulations, they really did not include or tend to include guidance on tops, limbs, and low-value products. And now that we're removing more of that material and have increasing markets, we need to say something about that. And again, assure the public that we know the science and we know how to handle that. Excuse me. So what we did first in the process is, of course, we formed that working group, and then we took a look at what other states have been doing in this area. And we were able to look at a handful of states, mostly in the northeast, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, the M's, and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And we wanted to get an idea of how they approached this topic, and so we could have some sort of framework that would help us rather than create something new to help guide our process. So that helped us inform the work that we were doing. We had a good sort of foundation to move forward. This working group worked for 8 months. There was about 21 members in it. One of the other things that we did was we developed a science-based tool, Ecology of Dead Wood, and Xander will talk more about that. And we did an assessment of these state guidelines to guide us. Some of the funding for this work was through a multi-party contract with the state of Massachusetts, and so these recommendations in June of 2010, the guidelines were actually included in a Massachusetts report. And our continued outreach, which I will talk more about after we produced the guidelines, was funded by a conservation innovation grant. So here's what we tried to accomplish here. The guidelines would define biomass and downwoody material, encourage the protection of soils, wildlife habitat, water, and other forest attributes, and address several audiences, including field foresters, loggers, but also policymakers and actual biomass facilities. We thought these guidelines would be helpful for them in keeping their contract with the public. Third-party certifiers in guidance programs like FSC, there's usually a criteria that says leave adequate amounts of downwoody material. Well, we're hoping that our guidelines can help answer how much material needs to be leaved. And of course, the general public. It discusses forestry operations, sustainability, and actually says a bit about the carbon implications of this. So there were some important topics that we wanted to dig into, and this is where I'd like Xander to come on and guide us through how we dealt with these topics and the scientific research that we put together to help move the process along. Xander, are you ready?
Yeah. So we generated this list of topics by looking at the existing guidelines, as Bob discussed earlier, that assessment of biomass harvesting and retention guidelines. And so what we found in reviewing those and other sort of related BMPs from as far away as Nordic countries is there sort of a consistent set of elements that many of these state-based guidelines tackled. And so we use those as sort of our table of contents to frame our thinking and guide us as we walk through this and to make sure we didn't miss key pieces. And we also use this as a tool in our science investigation so that we could think about how dead wood affected various pieces of the forest, for example, soil fertility. That would lead you down a particular research path versus, say, wildlife habitat. Both are important. Foresters think about both, but the scientific community may be actually quite different. You might get papers from a wildlife biologist and also a soil scientist. We had to integrate both of those. So in the Forest Guild guidelines, we built all of these in. And a lot of this, as Bob mentioned, was based on our review of scientific literature In the Northeast, we looked at about 100 scientific papers, and the goal was to try to find any useful information that would help us understand how dead wood and those attributes of the forest that were most likely to be affected by intensive biomass harvest, how those elements fit into a larger ecological picture. And because in order to sort of focus us a little bit, we honed in on those forest types that were most likely to be under harvest and cover the most area in the Northeast. So we looked at spruce fir, we looked at northern hardwoods, we looked at that oak hickory forest and sort of the southern New England through Pennsylvania, and then we also looked at white pine, red pine forests, because there's some different ecological issues there. Now I should mention at this point, we did a similar process in the Southeast, and there we reviewed even more research papers, about 230, and we had a review team of about 12 scientists. In the Northeast, we had fewer scientists. We didn't have quite the budget for our review, but we did have some reviewers from, again, from Yale University and University of Maine, and my co-author, Matt Kelty, is at University of Massachusetts. And the reason we put all the effort into getting the scientists on board and making sure our science discovery was good was because we wanted, as Bob mentioned, we wanted this to be a defensible process. We wanted it to be based on the best available science so that both industry and the general public and foresters felt like, hey, we're doing this based on the best knowledge we can. We're not just shooting from the hip. So the kind of information we gathered was looking at things like the quantities and characteristics of snags and downwoody material in old growth or protected areas. So that would be one model for how much would a natural system have. Well, how much is in an existing sort of protected area that might not have had much human influence. That would be one guide. Other guides, we tried to identify, well, what are the habitat requirements of different animals? And there are a number of animals, at least 40 in the Northeast, that are associated with dead wood. And so we can say those animals, if we remove every stick of dead wood, those animals would be affected. Now it becomes more difficult as you say, well, what if you have a little bit less? Would you see that directly in a population drop of, say, the golden-footed mouse? Well, that's a tougher test to prove, but there is some information that links the quantity of dead wood in different areas with wildlife populations. So that was another element in the process. You can also look at it from the nutrient status, and there's a number of studies that looked at nutrient budgets within different kinds of forest stands, whether it's spruce fir or oak hickory, and how dead wood plays into that cycle. And so that can be another guide for what we retain and how we retain it. Now it's worth pointing out that science at this point, we don't have definitive answers to the question of how much should be left. There's nothing that you can point to that is a p-value in scientific measurements that say for a given forest type you have to leave this amount. There are a lot of different insights that you can gain from science that suggest, well, this is probably the range of material you want to leave on site. And it's very clear that some retention is crucial. So then we move from this scientific base that provides us a firm footing, but not necessarily the direct kind of rules that foresters might need to actually go out and implement and operationalize this in the field. Well, a good example of that is a lot of scientific studies use tons per acre, or actually megagrams per hectare, but tons per acre of something like dead wood. And so we can say that we need, this many tons of dead wood on site, but there's a broken link between that and, well, how much of the harvest slash should be left. You can, if you have a research plot or some sort of intensive management, you could go out and measure it and figure out the number of tons. But in general, most operations, that doesn't make a lot of sense. The money isn't there, and the sideboards aren't tight enough to really justify it. So with that, we sort of said, okay, we can use the science, but now we need to also refer to the management expertise of our Forest Guild members and others whom we turn to for advice on, well, how much should we leave? And a good example of that is from the other guidelines. And so you can see, for example, Pennsylvania recommends leaving 15 to 30% of harvestable biomass on site. Well, Missouri says leave a third of the harvest residue. And so I'll turn it back over to Bob here, but that was where we transitioned from the solid footing in ecological science to professional judgment and what foresters know needs to happen in the woods. Bob, are you still with us? He might have his mic on mute. So I'm going to go ahead and...
I'm back on. Xander,
oh, here you are.
Well,
hello.
do you mind if I...
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Bob.
Do you mind if I ask a question? I know we're
Sure.
not against protocol, but if you go back a slide, so when you say 20%, are you talking about 20% of the total biomass or just the residual tops and limbs in these examples? I mean, harvestable biomass, you know, what does that mean? Is that basically the residues, or is it 20 to 30% of 15 to 20% or whatever? I mean, do they state what they're suggesting you leave, or is it just the residuals that they're talking about? So you can take out 70% of the residuals.
Well, that's a great question, Michael. And it's, if you were just to read the Pennsylvania guidelines, my view is that question isn't fully answered. I think if you talk to people and you try to sort of read between the lines or try to understand what they meant, I think you're right that they're really what they mean is of that sort of residual, the slash, what's left over. But this what you brought up is the issue about how you define these things. And of course, biomass is everything. It's anything living in the woods. So the bolls, the herbs, the grasses, the leaves, everything. Taking out 30% of absolutely every cell of biomass in the woods, that doesn't make sense. So I think we have to sort of use a little bit of intuition here and say that they must be implying that they're talking about the residuals. But I think if you look at the guidelines, it can be a little bit confusing. And so one of our recommendations when we reviewed all the existing state guidelines was anytime you write a guideline for this kind of material, you need to be very clear about what you're talking about. And that's, most of these guidelines have different definitions. Maine, for example, talked a little bit about energy wood versus other kinds of wood. And so you might be differentiating between energy wood, what I think of sort of more generally as biomass, and pulpwood. And so how you define these things can really drive how they're operationalized in the field. I don't know, did I get sort of towards the answer to that question, Michael? Yes, Michael just typed in that would depend on the type of treatment. Right. And that actually is a good segue, I think, for Bob's next couple of slides.
Thanks. As Xander said, we first looked at what some of the other states had done and how they handled this to get an idea of how we might move forward, and also to use that information for the percentages, and people did some hard work in these other states to try to figure this out. Most of the concern was in the nutrient material that exists in the small twigs and branches, and a lot of the tree's nutrients do exist in the smaller material, so the focus is on how much of that needs to be left behind in order to keep the nutrients cycling and protected in the forest. So what the working group came up with was to treat it in the following way. We thought about what an average type of thinning was in the northern forest and said, let's just sort of focus on that, and to give us some grounding. So general, when a third of the base area is being removed on a 15 to 20 year cycle, which is what we think is an average harvest, that we should retain a quarter to a third, 25% to 33% of the slash, tops and limbs from the harvest, what we call down woody material. But we recognize, and this was a good part of our discussions, that it's hard to have a rule of thumb for forestry that applies everywhere in every situation. And we recognize that. So practically in the field, we have to adjust these numbers to take into account the type of harvest, the type of soils, and a number of other factors. So what were those factors? And in the Northeast, we came up with 3. The number of live trees that we were leaving on the site, because those are the trees that could add downwoody material into the future. The more we have, the more material we will get naturally as those trees break apart. The time between harvests, how often are we coming back and doing these kind of harvests, and what are the soils like, which really is the key factor. Do we have a rich soils we're growing on, then we have a little bit more leeway. There are some sites we have problems with the soils and we need to take more care. Actually, as we moved and began to think about this in the Southeast, we came up with another factor, which I'll show you on the next slide. And we combined 3 and we made it 4, and we have an interesting graphic to look at here. So basically we're saying as harvesting intensity decreases and these 3 factors, now 4 factors increase, we might be required to leave less or more of the tops and slash behind. So here's the graphic that we came up with in our Southeast discussions, which are going on right now. Let me see if I can grab that arrow and show you. So, on this side of the graph, we have the soil fertility factors that go from rich soils to poor soils. So in the particular site you're working on, you determine what kind of soils you have, and maybe you have poor soils, you locate yourself up here on this axis. Go over to the same comparable axis over here, and we have the existing downwoody material on site. Now this is the new factor we came up with, and we finally realized that all sites are different. You may have a site that just had a ice storm damage a few years ago and a tremendous amount of down material on the ground. Well, in that case, maybe you don't have to leave 30%. So what we want to do is look at the material that's available before the harvest on the site and compare that to what we would expect in natural stands. And if we have a lot of material, you're down here in the high zone. If there's not much material, you're up here in the low zone. You can take the point here and the point here, you draw a line across that, and then you move to your other axis here. So your harvest intensity, from you're taking a lot of material out till you're not taking a lot of material out, and your other comparable axis down here, the frequency of your harvest, you draw points in here, connect the line between these points, and then you'll have an intersection between the two, and you can locate yourself somewhere on the graph, which begins to give you an idea of how to move off of this sort of middle ground of 30%. In some cases you might want to leave all the slash. In some, you might have a situation where the soils are really good. You've got a lot of material on the ground already, and this really isn't a concern. So what we're trying to do here is answer to 2 audiences. One is to the foresters and loggers that understand that this is really site dependent, and it's hard to come up with just one figure that applies for everybody on every acre in all instances. And the other side of the people looking at this thing is, the general public that want some kind of insurance that enough material is left behind. And it seems like our approach, by having a sort of a middle ground number and then moving off of that on a sliding scale, is working for most people. So if you're a logger or a forester and you're saying, I really don't have to leave a lot of material, That may be fine, but you should be able to explain this in this graphic and explain why you wind up down in this low section. So if you have no idea what your soils are, you're not going to make a good argument. But if you have researched that, you might be able to come up with a real legitimate argument for what you're talking about. So in addition to setting a number for down woody material and a sliding scale, we give some other guidance. Avoid harvesting on these low nutrient sites, or adjust the tops and branches, needles, and leaves accordingly, as the graph tells us. We want to retain down woody material of all sizes, not just the fine material, but also larger materials, large down logs that provide a number of valuable ecological benefits to the stand. The material should be left distributed across the site as much as possible, and whenever possible, minimize the removal of needles and leaves where most of the nutrients exist. And we know that's not possible in all situations, but if you can harvest in the winter, then we would encourage you to do that. So that was the down woody material. The other key factor that we were looking for targets for was standing dead material. So Xander helped us collect research to look at what additional tree snags we might want to leave and try to tailor that. Our goal was to tailor it to specific forest types. So we'd have information on each types. However, what we found that there was too much scientific uncertainty to provide specific targets for each forest types. And look at some of the ranges in here that we found, 8 to 16, and up here 2 to 50. These kind of ranges are so broad that we didn't have the information that we could actually tailor it to particular forest types. So what we did was we developed sort of an average for all the forest types of for the Northeast, and this allowed us to come up with some targets in a range where it could be varied site to site, but we actually have some specific numbers in here for leaving material. We looked at large trees greater than 18 inches and trees 12 to 18 inches, and then snags that went up to 10 inches, and came up with actual numbers and basal area that can be used as guidelines for leaving this kind of material. We offered some guidelines for general harvesting operations, and these were probably similar to what many of you see in best management practices. Generally, though, we want to protect forest land from conservation to non-forest use or plantations, and we're kind of always put that in. Let's use that as a guide. Keep forest as forest. Involving professional foresters in the development of the plans and harvest has been shown to be helpful and mitigate any problems, and certainly use appropriate equipment matched to site and operations. Within our group, there is a lot of discussion about whole tree harvesting and large machinery and how ill-adapted it can be to doing thinnings in stands that were tight, and how that might lead people to changing their silvicultural approaches to adapt to the equipment. Whereas you would have done sort of a light thinning and remove few trees. If that's the only kind of equipment you can get into the site, you change your silvicultural approaches and you do something different. We don't want to see that happening, so we included this caveat here that we should be using appropriate equipment. We also knew, because of discussions, that there were questions about carbon and release of emissions, atmospheric carbon, and the whole idea about helping to mitigate climate change. And the Guild is actively involved in those discussions. I'm not going to get into this too much because it's such a wide-ranging discussion and now involves the EPA and setting rules for carbon emissions. But we wanted to note that this is a concern about forest carbon, and our position is that carbon neutrality for forest biomass cannot be taken for granted. Some people believe it should be, but we don't. And it's really a site-specific and forest-specific aspect and needs to be taken into consideration in that way. what helped us after we completed the guidelines is we received a conservation innovation grant that allowed us to spend the last year basically promoting and educating people on the guidelines. So we used that grant in a 9-state region in the Northeast to engage individuals. We used it to create and disseminate outreach materials. We took the original report and made it into a small trifold brochure that you can slip in your pocket or keep in your notebook or bring out into the field. And then we set about setting up and documenting demonstration areas, and we've been doing that for the last year. The Nature Conservancy did one a few weeks ago in Pennsylvania, and we've had them in Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire, and we're going to have one in Maine soon. So we invite people to these workshops and demo areas and show them how the guidelines were implemented and talk about any problems or benefits to doing that. And we're developing an online training module that people will be able to access on our website along with other interactive tools. And we hope to have that probably online by the end of the year. Our outreach strategy, how we went about this, really was linked to this diffusion of innovation theory that were used when hybrid corn was introduced into the agricultural community. And what happened in those cases is even though this new hybrid corn was many times as productive as the old corn, the farmers weren't planting it, and it was pretty surprising. And what they found out that any type of new innovation takes some time to work its way into the population, and you'll find that there are early innovators, there are a small number, 2.5%, then there are these early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And we thought that that kind of dynamic is probably very close to what happens in the forestry sector, and that's what we would expect. So what we wanted to concentrate on is getting those early innovators and early adopters off the ground and giving them some assistance in implementing these guidelines, and then others will follow forward. And so we're concentrating, and we will continue to concentrate on getting those innovators and early adopters moving. Our objectives with that CIG grant is to awareness, understanding, exception, and eventually adoption by forest managers and landowners. And hopefully we'd like to see them integrated into state-level best management practices or maybe the procurement requirements for biomass facilities. And we know that there are biomass energy legislation coming down the pike and incentive programs, and it may be important to integrate guidelines into that to give the assurance that the public should send the money this way. What we did was educate, communicate, and distribute. We had a lot of one-on-one meetings between staff and between our guild members and loggers, foresters, and landowners. And we're involved in several conferences and forums where we're able to speak about the guidelines and present the guidelines, including a Forest Guild regional meeting that we had in September up in Vermont. The preliminary results, I think, were very positive. We certainly have raised the level of awareness. People understand that these guidelines are out there. We've gotten some nice endorsements. People have called the Guild guidelines the best of breed that's out there. Other people have said they're practical. You can implement them on the ground, and they can be a preferred alternative. We're seeing adoption from state agencies, some consulting firms. Those are the innovators are putting this in. There's conversations about BMPs and bringing these into BMPs, particularly in Vermont. Biomass facilities, we're involved in discussions with them about how they could use our guidelines as one of the report cards that they'd like to show to the public. And of course, as I mentioned, state or even federal biomass energy legislation. We're trying to keep up with that and make people aware that this may be a tool that will be helpful. Our work in the Northeast has led to doing the same process in the Southeast, and we're almost done with the guidelines of that, and we hope we can move into an outreach program similar to the Northeast. We're also involved now in a study of biomass and carbon implications in the Southeast. We're formally involved in one in the Northeast in Massachusetts, and we wanted to do a similar type of project in the Southeast, and we're involved in that. And we feel like we have a pretty good opportunity to do some guidelines in the Pacific Northwest. So things continue to move forward for us. The program isn't over, and these are some of the lessons that we learned. We heard from our field tours that field practitioners really would like a visual aid so that they could estimate downwoody material. They're not too interested in going out and actually measuring that. It'd probably be too time consuming on every sale. But if they could get a good handle from a visual conception of this, that would be helpful. And we know that that has been done, I think, by the Forest Service in some cases, and we're hopeful to develop a tailored visual aid tool for the Northeast. We found that in our demo areas on partial thinnings that hitting this 30% figure is not that difficult in these areas. It takes a little bit of thought, a little bit of changes in practice, but it doesn't seem to be that onerous. The operations were not greatly affected, and the cost is probably minimal. There is a cost. There's a cost in the amount of material that does not come out, but that's probably minimal because studies show that on average 10 to 20% of the material never comes out of the woods, even if you try to remove it all. So this is not raising the limit that much for this. And there is an administrative cost to making this happen, which we think will go down once people get more accustomed to it. We don't have a lot of information now on how this works in heavy harvest, partly because the people that are maybe doing some of those things aren't that interested in what we're talking about, but we do want to work with them and try this out on some of the more heavier harvest and get some information on how that works. We think that this whole concept of valuing downwoody material and standing dead trees, it's been around for a while, but it's still a little bit new for people in the field and hasn't been fully integrated into forestry practices. But it's not that hard. It's pretty easy. Once some of these things are spotted or identified in the field, it's pretty easy to start to keep track of them, at least visually, and understand what's going on and probably work them into the forest inventories eventually. The bottom line for us is this is really moving well for us, but changing this kind of practice in the field is really a long-term proposition, probably longer than we thought at the beginning. And so we're thinking that, 10 years from now, we think we can really see this widespread in the forestry profession, and when we'll keep working away at it. So a lot of improvement right at the beginning, but we know it's going to take a long time to reach the ultimate goal. Our conclusion is we hope our guidelines are helpful. We've seen instances that they have been, and we're going to continue this project and provide service to biomass facilities that would like us to work with them, and certainly state governments and individuals that would like our help. So thank you. This is the last slide, gives you some connections to some of the work that we've done. Please go to our website. You can access it on our website. What you won't find here is some of the recent reports that we've done for the Southeast, but you'll also find them available on our website. So I'd like to conclude my speaking portion of this and see if we have any questions and we can answer any. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob and Xander. That was very informative and good stuff. Very difficult issue to grapple with. But certainly, we I guess getting ahead of the game because we're probably going to see a lot more biomass harvesting in the future. I guess I'll read the questions, and please type in your questions. I have a couple as well, but I'll read one from Carrie. She said, I guess it's a she. Can you share a copy of the full reference for the hybrid corn studies?
Yes, Carrie, I can do that for you. Maybe if you're anybody that's interested in that, but certainly you, Carrie, please, if you would just send me an email, I'll dig them out of my files and send them to you. Most of what I found was just done by doing Google searches, so I encourage you to try that as well. But please send me an email. It's bob.purcell@verizon.net.
Bob, you can type your email in the
I will.
in the
Thank
box
you.
there.
That's a good idea.
And also, those of you who want to get CFE credits from SAF, please type in your email, and we'll take care of that one credit for this hour. Let's see, another question from Kerry. Do you have many guidelines on how to make a biomass harvest more cost-effective, efficient from an operational planning aspect? I had similar kind of question.
This is Xander. I'll go ahead and jump in on that. One of the things we've seen across the country, so beyond just the Northeast, is that a key piece is integrating biomass because it's such a low value product. If you can integrate it with other operations, a saw log harvest or you know, some sort of other product coming out, then obviously they can sort of help, the operations can be knit together. You get some sort of coordination and scale benefits. It's better for the site ecologically because you probably have fewer skidder turns, but it also helps making the whole package more economical. I think that the economics of biomass are really up in the air. When we started this project in 2007, it looked like biomass was going to take off. Of course, the economy has changed significantly since then, and one of the factors that we've seen over the last couple of years is oil prices have stabilized somewhat, and they're not as big a driver around interest in biomass, and similarly carbon markets have kind of flattened out and declined. So right now what we've seen is actually pellets seem to be driving some of the economic interest in this kind of low-grade material from the forest. And when we're talking about pellets, we're actually talking about a slightly different class of material, because you're probably not going to be able to make pellets out of some of the branches or tops. In most pelletizing processes, they require a cleaner chip. So that may mean that you get a premium, you may get a better price for the material, but it also means that you may even be focused on tree boles, or at least small trees, if you're harvesting for that market. And I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that biomass operations are not created equal, and the market that you're addressing and the local sort of pool of loggers and their level of mechanization will drive the efficiency of your biomass operation. Where I sit in Santa Fe, New Mexico, most of the logging seems to happen with guys with an old chainsaw and pickup truck. So that's not very efficient, whereas if you go to some operations in Oregon where they're pretty highly mechanized and have found efficiencies by getting people inside forwarders and Timco harvesters and that sort of thing, that they can move a lot of wood out, and have found that that's the way they can make their biomass market or harvest more efficient. So I don't think that's a particularly satisfying answer, Carrie, but hopefully it sort of points you that it's tough to figure out how to make those the most efficient as possible, and it's really going to depend on local variance. So there might be some help in the synthesis of knowledge from biomass harvesting case studies. That's this report right here. That's where we looked at some of the economics across the country for biomass harvesting and removal operations. And maybe another, I don't know if Bob wants to chime in on this, but another aspect of the economics is how the network that you set up. And I think that there's a real opportunity at the sort of community scale for making biomass projects work, in part because there's a greater benefit to the local community. You're using it for more efficiently in terms of using it for heat, and so it might be able to get a better price for it. And that's part of the idea behind this market-based approach to community wood energy. So with that, I don't know, Bob, if you want to chime in on the economics, but I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I'll just reinforce what you said. You know, the difference in what potentially could be paid for biomass varies greatly, whether it's used in a thermal application or electric-led application. These electric producers are capped in really what they can pay for biomass. It's very low because they have these electrical production agreements. But the thermal applications are much more efficient. They're using much more of the material, and you're comparing it to high price of oil. So the amount that they can pay is much greater. Some of these thermal applications can save 70% of their oil bill by doing this. The problem is coming up with the initial capital and financing, and that's what we're also trying to work on. But you can see that once they get installed, they have a lot of margin to play with, so they can pay a lot more for biomass. So what we've been working on is trying to establish that type of connection for the foresters and landowners, that their material will go into a community project and be used in thermal applications. And as Xander said, we think it's a benefit for just rural communities as far as working together in the economic chain. And the landowners will make more money, and the high schools or hospitals in that area that are using the biomass are going to save a heck of a lot on their energy bills. So that's one sort of roundabout way to increase the cost effectiveness of what's done in the field. The other thing I would emphasize is, as Xander said, this is intensive work, and we're dealing with low-grade materials, so the more that it can be mechanized, the more cost-effective it is. The downside to that is the more that it's mechanized, the fewer people that are working, and sometimes these equipments are not matched to the actual intent of the harvest, and we will run into problems there. But it's quite obvious that the larger machines that are more mechanized can move a lot of material, and it's much more cost effective.
Please continue to type in your questions if you have any. I guess we've got a few more minutes left, so we might as well have a discussion. I was wondering, so you're just picking up on that mechanization. I guess, most of us, I think, are from the Northeast who are participating, and so we don't have that much mechanization like the South and Europe. But are there, building on Carrie's question, are there recommendations on harvesting equipment, methodologies for, maybe you can expand on whole tree harvesting and how you leave the slash in the forest, those kind of things. Are there machines out there that are better than others?
Yeah, this is Xander again. I think one topic I'll touch on in that realm is bundlers. So there's been some discussion about, I've seen this come out of Minnesota, about machines that will bundle up essentially tops, and you take those out of the woods. And my view is that's probably the wrong direction to focus, because that material is not very good when you burn it, because it's got a lot of the nutrients in it, and so it's not very good for a furnace. For a boiler, it creates a lot of what they call clinkers and sort of technical problems. But also on the ecological side, you're removing just the sort of material that you probably should be leaving on site, the needles and leaves. So that's one sort of road of mechanization I would probably avoid for most sites. So there are probably places where it makes sense, but at the same time, I think that what we've seen from places like Europe is that sometimes a key piece is the forwarder. So having something, a cut-to-length system where you can get it on a forwarder, that's not too uncommon in Maine, and that can sometimes help boost efficiency. Bob, do you want to chime in on the topic?
Yeah, I'd really like to emphasize that last point. I saw a similar operation last week at the University of the South in Tennessee on their lands. So the combination of whole tree harvesting equipment, guys sitting in the cab running this thing, just grabbing the tree. It severs the tree at the base, it picks it up, it delimbs it, it cuts it to length, and it lies it on the ground. Very efficient, and it can really reach in and do a nice job of thinning in the stand. Where most of the concern and problems happen is then how do you get that material out of the woods? And grapple skidders if you're just dropping the whole tree and then they grab a hold of the whole tree, you get a lot of damage coming out, and it limits what you can do in the stand. But combining it with a forwarder, I mean, I saw it in action. The forwarder comes in, it's light on the land, and doesn't do a lot of damage, and then he just picks up the lengths and puts them in the back of the forwarder, and you're off and running. What you're not getting, which is probably a good thing, is you're not getting the smaller branches in the tops, and you're leaving that behind, which is exactly the point of our retention guidelines. So there's some loss in material, but it's probably more than made up for by protecting the ecology of the site. So I think generally, we'd like to see more of those kind of tandem uses of equipment, and in my experience, there aren't enough forwarders out there operating. I wish they were more. So that's one approach to the job that I think really is working.
And I can't resist chiming in on the distribution of material back in the woods. So one of the, as Bob sort of identified, when you have one of those cut-to-length systems, much of the tops branches can actually stay sort of distributed where the tree was felled. There are obviously a lot of systems nationwide and in the Northeast particularly where we're actually pulling the whole tree out to the landing and delimbing, and then you're stuck with the pile of the material that you really want on site right at the landing. And so, one of the things, this I think is maybe more common in pine systems in places like the Southeast, or maybe conifer systems in Maine, but then we're sort of focused on, okay, well, can you take material back into the woods on a sort of empty run as the skidder goes back in to get another load? And there's some question about the effect of having that slash sort of, as the skidder goes back, just dropping it in a pile somewhere, or trying to distribute it a little more evenly. And I think that I think from a say nutrient perspective, obviously if you were to do it over 1,000 years and all those piles ended up in the same place, yeah, that might be an issue, but that's not really kind of the scale of things we're worried about. So long as the material makes it back into the woods, even if it's in piles, that's a good thing. And those piles actually have some wildlife habitat value. So there's some trade-offs to having it totally evenly distributed, but making sure that it doesn't just sit in the landing in a big pile is kind of a key piece. Other questions?
Well,
that's
added
good.
to that one operational problem that people have challenged us with is, when you're doing that whole tree harvesting and grapple skidding, they don't want to bring the material back in. They can't take the top off. So one way around that is to select certain trees that probably don't have a lot of value and don't pull them out. And I've seen operations that have done that. So whatever it may be, 1 out of 10 trees, they tell the operator, you cut it, you just leave it in place. And that can hit the criteria or for leaving a certain percentage in the woods. And so there are, I think, different ways to work at this that will work out eventually. We just need a little bit of practice and partnership on it to make it happen.
Yeah, well, that's good. I was just going to say, here in Pennsylvania, the guys I know who are harvesting for biomass are doing the grapple skidding, but it's mostly on thinning operations or salvage thinning from gypsy moth or something. So they're leaving a lot of snags and inferior trees, I guess, or hopefully good trees. But we have a study that we haven't published yet on Sungran. From Sungran, I'll just mention, looking at the cost of mechanized harvesting with different treatments. We looked at a clear-cut shelterwood and thinning and a salvage thinning, and pretty much the thinnings are the most cost effective. The shelter wood was obviously the costliest. The clear cut was more costly, and I guess that relates to the amount of time that was amount of trees. So the more trees you take out, the more it cost, and it also was more costly per ton than the thinning, which was interesting. We're still sorting that out, but I guess the point is, if we're going to be looking at costs, obviously the economies of scale, the size of the acreage, and the landscape, terrain, slope, number of landings all play into it.